This dramatization is based on real events, but some details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. The purpose is educational, showing how seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when dialogue and understanding are abandoned. In the shadows of America's urban landscape lie forgotten territories where official maps end and invisible boundaries begin. This is the story of one such place, a single city block in Oakland, California, that became the epicenter of a conflict that would challenge everything residents thought they knew about community, territory, and the price of silence. During the late 1980s, as crack cocaine ravaged inner-city neighborhoods and municipal budgets tightened, certain areas of Oakland began to disappear from city maintenance schedules, police patrol routes, and public consciousness. Ghost Block, a name that would emerge from the streets themselves, represented more than urban decay. It became a canvas for territorial expression, a battleground for identity, and ultimately, a crime scene that would baffle investigators for years. This documentary reconstructs the social, economic, and cultural forces that transformed a residential block into a powder keg of artistic rivalry and territorial pride. Through interviews with former residents, community activists, retired law enforcement officials, and urban sociologists, we examine how abandonment, opportunity gaps, and the human need for recognition created conditions for an escalating conflict that would leave 12 people dead and an entire community forever changed. More than a crime story, this is an investigation into how invisible wars can develop in America's forgotten spaces, and how the absence of institutional support can allow simmering tensions to explode into tragedy that reverberates far beyond the boundaries of a single city block. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The first time Marcus Williams walked down what would become known as Ghost Block, it was still just another deteriorating street in East Oakland's industrial corridor. October 1987. The morning fog hung heavy between the skeletal remains of Victorian houses, their broken windows reflecting nothing but emptiness back at the world. Marcus was 17, carrying a backpack full of spray cans and the kind of restless energy that comes from having nowhere else to channel artistic ambition. "Man, this place is perfect," he whispered to his crew member Tommy Chen as they surveyed the abandoned duplex at 47th and International Boulevard. The building had been gutted by a fire 6 months earlier, its blackened frame standing like a monument to municipal neglect. "Look at all that wall space. Clean walls, no tags, no competition." Tommy adjusted his baseball cap and nodded slowly. As a second-generation Chinese-American kid who'd grown up in Oakland's changing demographics, he understood the value of claiming space in a city that seemed to forget entire neighborhoods existed. The duo represented the founding members of what would become the Iron Wolves crew, Marcus bringing street credibility from his years in West Oakland's housing projects, Tommy contributing technical skill learned from his uncle's sign painting shop in Chinatown. The block itself told the story of Oakland's economic trajectory in the 1980s. Stretching between International Boulevard and Foothill Avenue, the residential street had once housed dock workers, railroad employees, and their families during the city's industrial heyday. But as manufacturing jobs disappeared and white flight accelerated, property values plummeted. Landlords stopped maintaining buildings. The city, facing budget crises, reduced services to areas considered economically non-viable. Dr. Sarah Chen, an urban sociologist who studied Oakland's demographic shifts during this period, would later explain the phenomenon in academic terms that somehow made the human cost sound clinical and inevitable. When municipal resources become scarce, cities engage in a form of triage, she said during a 1995 interview for this documentary. Certain neighborhoods, particularly those with declining tax bases and minimal political representation, essentially disappear from active governance. They become what we call sacrifice zones, areas where normal civic functions cease to operate. For Marcus and Tommy, academic terminology meant nothing. What mattered was the reality they saw every day: empty buildings with intact walls, perfect for large-scale pieces. No security guards, no regular police patrols, no property owners who cared enough to call in vandalism reports. Ghost Block offered something rare in the world of graffiti art: complete creative freedom. Their first piece took 3 nights to complete. A massive mural covering the entire south-facing wall of the burned duplex, depicting a wolf pack moving through an industrial landscape. Marcus handled the bold outlines and color fills, while Tommy added intricate details and shading that gave the piece depth and movement. They worked between midnight and dawn, timing their sessions around the sparse patrol schedule they'd memorized after weeks of observation. It felt like claiming something that was already forgotten, Tommy recalled years later, his voice carrying the weight of everything that came after. Like we were bringing life back to a place that had been written off. We had no idea we were starting something that would get so out of control. The mural's completion in November 1987 marked Ghost Block's transformation from forgotten real estate to contested territory. Word spread through Oakland's underground art scene about the new spot. A whole block of abandoned buildings with minimal law enforcement oversight. By winter, other crews had discovered the location. The first competition came from a group calling themselves Urban Prophets, led by a charismatic artist known only as Sage. Where Iron Wolves focused on representational imagery and technical skill, Urban Prophets specialized in abstract compositions and political messaging. Their style reflected the influence of Bay Area activism, incorporating symbols from the Black Panther Party, United Farm Workers, and anti-apartheid movements. Sage, whose real name remains unknown to this day, was reportedly a college dropout from UC Berkeley, who turned to street art after becoming disillusioned with academic activism. His crew included artists from diverse ethnic backgrounds, African American, Latino, Filipino, united by a shared belief that art should challenge power structures rather than merely decorate abandoned spaces. The ideological difference between crews became apparent when Urban Prophets began covering Iron Wolves pieces with their own work. In graffiti culture, going over someone else's piece without permission represents a serious violation of unwritten rules. But Urban Prophets justified their actions through political rhetoric, arguing that art in abandoned neighborhoods should serve community needs rather than individual ego. Maria Santos, a community activist who lived 3 blocks away and documented the early tensions through photographs and journal entries, remembered the shift in atmosphere. At first, we were happy to see young people caring about the neighborhood again, she said. Even if it was just graffiti, it felt like someone was paying attention to our area. But then you could sense the competition getting more serious. The pieces got bigger, more aggressive. You could feel something building. Santos's photographs from this period reveal the rapid transformation of Ghost Block from scattered tags to elaborate territorial markers. Each crew developed distinct visual signatures and claimed specific buildings as their canvas. Iron Wolves dominated the duplex and 2 adjacent houses on the north side of the street. Urban Prophets claimed the former corner store and a row of connected apartments on the south side. The territorial division might have remained stable if not for the arrival of a 3rd crew in spring 1988. The Midnight Collective emerged from the city's emerging hip-hop scene, bringing a different aesthetic and attitude to Ghost Block. Led by brothers Jerome and Anthony Parker, the crew combined graffiti with breakdancing and rap music, treating abandoned buildings as venues for impromptu performances. Jerome Parker, known as J-Rock in the scene, had spent 2 years in Los Angeles learning advanced graffiti techniques from crews connected to the emerging gangster rap movement. His return to Oakland coincided with the city's own hip-hop explosion as local artists began developing a distinctive Bay Area sound that would later influence national rap music. "We weren't trying to start trouble with nobody," Anthony Parker said during a rare interview in 1994. "We just wanted a place to practice our art, all of it. Painting, dancing, music. Ghost Block had the space and the freedom. We thought there was room for everybody." The Midnight Collective's approach challenged both existing crews' claims to territorial exclusivity. Rather than confining themselves to specific buildings, they treated the entire block as a single canvas, creating pieces that flowed across multiple structures. Their style incorporated elements from both Iron Wolves' technical precision and Urban Prophet's political messaging, while adding musical and performance components that transformed static artwork into multimedia experiences. The integration of hip-hop culture attracted new participants to Ghost Block, including teenagers from other Oakland neighborhoods who came to practice breakdancing in the empty lots and abandoned garages. Weekend gatherings began spontaneously, drawing dozens of young people to what had been a completely deserted area just months earlier. Local resident Mrs. Dorothy Washington, an elderly African-American woman who had lived on the adjacent street for 30 years, watched the transformation with mixed feelings. It was nice to see life coming back, she remembered. But it was also scary, because we didn't know what these kids were really about. The police weren't coming around to check on things, so we were on our own to figure out if this was good or bad for the neighborhood. The lack of official oversight created a power vacuum that the crews themselves had to fill. Initially, informal agreements maintained peace between groups. Iron Wolves kept to their buildings, Urban Prophets maintained their territory, and Midnight Collective used the common areas for performances. But as summer 1988 approached, subtle signs suggested the informal détente was beginning to strain. Pieces began appearing that directly challenged other crews' work, not simply going over previous art, but incorporating elements that mocked or criticized rival groups' styles and messages. Tags appeared in disputed areas, testing the boundaries of territorial agreements. Most concerning, the art itself began reflecting increasing hostility, with imagery becoming more aggressive and politically charged. By August 1988, Ghost Block had evolved from an abandoned street into Oakland's most dynamic underground art scene. But the same creative energy that had brought life back to the forgotten neighborhood was also generating tensions that formal institutions, police, city government, community organizations were unprepared to address. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform a territorial dispute between artists into something far more dangerous. The last photograph in Maria Santos's collection from this period shows all three crews working simultaneously on different buildings, their members visible as small figures against massive murals that covered nearly every available wall surface on the block. Taken in late August 1988, the image captures a moment of creative intensity and territorial balance that would never exist again. Within weeks, the first signs of serious trouble would emerge, beginning a chain of events that would ultimately leave 12 people dead and transform Ghost Block from an artistic haven into a crime scene that haunts Oakland to this day. The first real warning came on a Tuesday night in September 1988 when Marcus Williams arrived at Ghost Block to find his crew's signature wolf mural defaced with a single word spray-painted in blood-red letters across the pack leader's face: sellout. Standing in the amber glow of the single functioning streetlight, Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of rage and recognition that the unspoken rules governing their underground world had just been shattered. The word wasn't random vandalism. It was a calculated insult that struck at the heart of tensions that had been building between the crews for months. The accusation stemmed from rumors circulating through Oakland's art community about Iron Wolves' connections to commercial interests. Marcus had been approached by a local record label owner who wanted to commission graffiti-style artwork for album covers and promotional materials. The offer represented legitimate income for skills that had previously existed only in the shadows, a chance to transform illegal art into legal profession. Tommy Chen, standing beside Marcus in the pre-dawn darkness, understood immediately what the vandalism meant. "This ain't just about the wall," he said, his voice tight with concern. "This is about them thinking we're trying to go mainstream, leave the scene behind." The commercialization of graffiti art was becoming a contentious issue throughout the Bay Area as hip-hop culture gained mainstream attention. Crews that had spent years developing their skills in illegal spaces suddenly found themselves courted by gallery owners, advertisers, and entertainment industry representatives. The opportunity to earn money from art that had always existed outside economic systems created philosophical divisions within the community. Urban Prophets, led by the mysterious Sage, had taken an increasingly militant stance against what they viewed as the co-optation of street art by commercial forces. Their political orientation, influenced by Bay Area activism and Third World liberation movements, framed the issue in terms of cultural authenticity versus corporate exploitation. Art born from the streets belongs to the streets, Sage declared during a heated confrontation at a downtown Oakland record store in early September. When artists start taking money from the same system that abandoned our neighborhoods, they become part of the problem, not the solution. The ideological conflict reflected broader tensions within Oakland's African American and Latino communities, as crack cocaine devastated inner-city neighborhoods while gentrification began appearing in other areas. Young people found themselves caught between traditional civil rights approaches that emphasized integration with existing systems and emerging nationalist movements that rejected cooperation with white-dominated institutions. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a sociologist at UC Berkeley who studied urban youth movements during this period, later analyzed the conflict in academic terms that illuminated its deeper significance. What was happening on Ghost Block represented a microcosm of larger debates about authenticity, resistance, and survival in post-industrial America, he explained. These young artists were negotiating questions that affected entire communities. How do you maintain cultural integrity while accessing economic opportunities? How do you resist systems that oppress your community while also trying to survive within those same systems? For Marcus Williams, these philosophical questions had immediate practical implications. The record label commission could provide enough money to help his mother avoid eviction from their West Oakland apartment. His younger sister needed books for her senior year of high school. Art that had begun as creative expression was becoming a potential path out of poverty, but only if he was willing to cross lines that other crews considered sacred. The tension escalated when Midnight Collective began organizing what they called block parties, weekend gatherings that combined graffiti, breakdancing, and rap performances for audiences that included people from outside the immediate scene. Jerome and Anthony Parker promoted the events through Bay Area hip-hop networks, drawing participants from San Francisco, Berkeley, and other Oakland neighborhoods. The parties transformed Ghost Block from an isolated artist enclave into a destination for Oakland's emerging hip-hop community. DJ equipment appeared in abandoned garages. Breakdancers used empty lots as performance spaces. Rappers cyphered in the shadows of massive murals, their lyrics echoing off building walls covered in increasingly elaborate artwork. Local resident Dorothy Washington watched the weekend transformations with growing concern. It went from maybe 10 or 15 kids doing their art to sometimes 50-60 people showing up with loud music and cars parked all over the neighborhood, she recalled. We didn't know if we should call the police or just stay inside and wait for it to be over. The lack of official oversight created a gray area where community concerns had no clear resolution mechanism. Oakland Police Department records from this period show minimal patrol activity in the Ghost Block area, reflecting department policy that prioritized resource allocation to neighborhoods with higher property values and more political influence. Residents like Washington found themselves managing the impact of increased activity without institutional support. The situation became more complex when urban prophets began using block parties as platforms for political education. Sage and his crew members distributed literature about police brutality, housing rights, and anti-apartheid activism between art demonstrations. Their presentations framed street art as a form of revolutionary communication that should serve community organizing rather than entertainment. We're not here to put on shows for people who come to gawk at ghetto art, Sage announced during a particularly tense October gathering. This space belongs to our people, and our art should be serving our people's liberation, not making outsiders feel good about themselves. The political dimension added new layers to territorial disputes as crews found themselves defending not just aesthetic territories, but ideological positions. Iron Wolves' potential commercial connections made them symbols of sellout mentality in urban prophets' rhetoric. Midnight Collective's party organizing attracted criticism as exploitation of community space for personal gain. Antonio Flaco Morales, a 17-year-old member of Urban Prophets, who later left the crew and moved to Los Angeles, provided insight into the internal dynamics during a 1995 interview. Sage was really charismatic, and he made everything sound like it was about justice and community, Flacco said. But looking back, I think he was also power-hungry. He wanted to control what everyone else was doing, make all the decisions about what was real art and what wasn't. The psychological pressure of constant territorial negotiation began affecting individual crew members differently. Some thrived on the competitive energy, pushing their artistic skills to new levels as they competed for visual dominance. Others found the stress overwhelming, especially as territorial boundaries became more rigid and penalties for violations more severe. Tommy Chen started experiencing what he later described as anxiety attacks when visiting Ghost Block. You couldn't just go there to paint anymore, he remembered. You had to think about which building you were approaching, whose territory you might be crossing, whether your piece was sending the right message. It stopped being about art and started being about politics and power. The transformation of creative space into contested territory reflected broader patterns in urban America as traditional community institutions, schools, churches, civic organizations struggled with reduced funding and increased social problems. Young people in neighborhoods like East Oakland found themselves creating informal governance systems to fill institutional voids, but without experience or resources to manage complex social dynamics effectively. November 1988 brought the first incident that crossed from artistic competition into physical confrontation. A new artist calling himself Phoenix began appearing on Ghost Block, working alone and creating pieces that deliberately incorporated elements from all three crews' styles. His technique was sophisticated enough to suggest formal training, and his pieces appeared in neutral areas that didn't directly challenge existing territorial claims. The mystery surrounding Phoenix's identity created paranoia among established crews. Some suspected he was an undercover police officer, gathering intelligence about illegal activity. Others believed he might be connected to rival crews from other Oakland neighborhoods, attempting to establish footholds in Ghost Block territory. The truth, according to Maria Santos's investigation, was both simpler and more troubling. Phoenix was David Kim, a 19-year-old community college student whose family had recently moved to Oakland from Los Angeles. His father worked as a mechanic, his mother cleaned office buildings downtown. David had developed his artistic skills in LA's more established graffiti scene and was attempting to find his place in Oakland's emerging hip-hop culture. He was just trying to fit in, Santos explained, but because nobody knew him and because the tensions were already so high, everyone saw his presence as a threat instead of recognizing he was just another young artist looking for a place to express himself. The suspicions surrounding Phoenix culminated in a confrontation on November 15th, when members from all three crews encountered him working on a piece near the corner store that served as Urban Profit's headquarters. What began as questioning about his identity and intentions escalated into pushing and shoving as crew members demanded he leave their territory. According to police reports filed the following day, David Kim required medical treatment for a broken nose and facial cuts after the altercation. The incident marked the first time Ghost Block territorial disputes had resulted in documented physical violence, crossing a line that transformed artistic competition into something more dangerous. The police report also represented the first official acknowledgement that Ghost Block had become a site requiring law enforcement attention. Officer Patricia Monroe, who responded to the incident, noted in her report that the abandoned buildings showed extensive graffiti and evidence of regular unauthorized gatherings. Her recommendations for increased patrol presence were filed with the department, but not immediately implemented due to resource constraints. The attack on David Kim had unintended consequences that further destabilized the fragile balance between crews. Rather than establishing clearer territorial boundaries, the violence created fear and uncertainty about what other lines might be crossed. Crew members began traveling in larger groups and staying alert for potential threats from rivals. The psychological atmosphere on Ghost Block shifted from creative competition to something approaching warfare mentality. Artists who had previously focused on developing their skills and pushing artistic boundaries found themselves increasingly concerned with defending territory and projecting strength to potential challengers. Mrs. Washington and other neighborhood residents began avoiding the area entirely, especially during weekend gatherings. "After that boy got hurt, we realized this wasn't just kids painting on walls anymore," she said. "This was becoming something dangerous and we didn't know how to make it stop." December brought the first disappearance. Tommy Chen failed to meet Marcus Williams for a planned session on December 8th and didn't respond to messages left with mutual friends. His uncle reported him missing to Oakland police after he failed to appear for work at the Chinatown sign shop for 3 consecutive days. The police investigation revealed that Tommy had last been seen on Ghost Block on the evening of December 7th, apparently working alone on a piece near the abandoned duplex that served as Iron Wolf's main territory. His spray cans and backpack were found scattered near the building, but there was no sign of Tommy himself. The disappearance created panic among all 3 crews, as members realized that whatever was happening on Ghost Block had escalated beyond artistic competition or even physical confrontation into something potentially life-threatening. The creative haven that had emerged from urban abandonment was becoming a place where young artists vanished without explanation. Marcus Williams found himself questioning everything about the scene he had helped create. "We just wanted a place to do our art," he said years later. "We thought we were bringing life back to a forgotten neighborhood. We had no idea we were creating conditions for something so dark." Tommy Chen's disappearance marked the end of Ghost Block's brief period as an underground artistic paradise and the beginning of its transformation into a crime scene that would challenge Oakland's law enforcement capabilities and leave a community searching for answers that remained elusive for years to come. The stage was set for the escalation that would ultimately claim 12 lives and transform a territorial dispute between artists into one of Oakland's most disturbing unsolved cases. Tommy Chen's disappearance shattered whatever remained of the unspoken agreements that had governed Ghost Block's underground art scene. In the 48 hours following the discovery of his abandoned supplies, the territorial boundaries that had previously defined crew territories became meaningless as fear and suspicion consumed the community that had formed around the abandoned street. Marcus Williams spent the first night after Tommy's disappearance walking the entire perimeter of Ghost Block, searching for clues that the police investigation had missed. The December air cut through his jacket as he examined every shadow, every doorway, every piece of debris that might provide some indication of what had happened to his closest friend and creative partner. The wolf mural that had established Iron Wolf's presence on the block now seemed to mock him from the wall of the burned duplex, its painted eyes reflecting the amber streetlight like a predator watching over abandoned territory. "I kept thinking I'd find something," Marcus recalled during a 2003 interview, his voice still carrying the weight of guilt and confusion from that night. "Maybe a piece of his clothing caught on a fence, or footprints, or some sign that would tell me which direction he went. But it was like he just vanished into thin air, like the block itself had swallowed him." The police investigation, led by Detective Ray Morrison of Oakland PD's Missing Persons Unit, faced immediate challenges that reflected broader problems with law enforcement in abandoned urban areas. The lack of regular patrol presence meant no baseline information about normal activity patterns on Ghost Block. No security cameras covered the area. Most importantly, the underground nature of the graffiti scene meant that many potential witnesses were reluctant to cooperate with police investigation. Detective Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had worked missing person cases throughout Oakland's most challenging neighborhoods, later described the Ghost Block investigation as uniquely difficult. "Usually, when someone disappears from a specific location, we have some kind of community infrastructure to work with," he explained. "Neighbors who know what's normal and what isn't, business owners who might have seen something, regular residents who can provide background context. But Ghost Block was like investigating a disappearance from a place that didn't officially exist. The absence of traditional community structures created an information vacuum that the crews themselves had to navigate. Without police presence or adult supervision, the young artists found themselves conducting their own investigation while simultaneously protecting themselves from whatever threat had claimed Tommy. The responsibility transformed teenagers who had been focused on artistic expression into amateur detectives operating in an environment where every shadow potentially concealed danger. Urban prophets responded to the crisis by increasing their political rhetoric and organizing what they called safety patrols, groups of crew members who moved through Ghost Block in coordinated formations, ostensibly to protect community space, but effectively establishing a more militant presence. Sage framed Tommy's disappearance as evidence of systemic violence against young artists of color, connecting it to broader patterns of police indifference toward crimes in abandoned neighborhoods. "They don't care when one of us disappears because they already wrote us off," Sage declared during a tense gathering in the former corner store that served as Urban Prophet's headquarters. "We can't depend on the system that abandoned this neighborhood to protect us. We have to protect ourselves and each other." The safety patrol concept attracted new members to Urban Prophets, particularly young people who were drawn to the group's combination of political consciousness and collective security. The crew's numbers swelled from 8 core members to nearly 20 active participants, many of whom had limited previous graffiti experience, but were motivated by the sense of purpose and protection that the group offered. Maria Santos, the community activist who had been documenting the evolution of Ghost Block since the first murals appeared, recognized the significance of this organizational shift. When the crews started talking about protection and safety patrols, they were essentially creating their own law enforcement system, she observed. These were teenagers taking on responsibilities that should have been handled by adults and institutions, but in the absence of those systems, they felt like they had no choice. Midnight Collective's response reflected the group's different relationship to Ghost Block and the broader hip-hop community. Jerome and Anthony Parker suspended the block parties that had been drawing crowds from across Oakland, but they also began reaching out to connections in other neighborhoods to gather information about similar incidents or threats. Their network within Bay Area hip-hop culture provided access to information sources that the other crews lacked. The Parker brothers' investigation revealed disturbing patterns that suggested Tommy's disappearance might not have been an isolated incident. Hip-hop venues in San Francisco and Berkeley had experienced unexplained vandalism. Several graffiti artists in other Oakland neighborhoods had reported being followed or threatened by unidentified individuals. Most concerning, 2 artists from different crews in Richmond had disappeared under similar circumstances within the past month. "We started realizing this might be bigger than just our block," Jerome Parker said during a rare interview in 1994. "Maybe Tommy wasn't taken because of crew beef or territorial disputes. Maybe there was something else happening, something that was targeting street artists across the whole Bay Area." The possibility of a broader threat targeting graffiti artists created a new dimension of fear that transcended the existing territorial conflicts between crews. If the danger came from outside Ghost Block's artistic community, then the internal disputes that had been escalating for months suddenly seemed less important than collective survival. This shift in perspective led to unprecedented cooperation between crews as they shared information and coordinated security measures. For the first time since the territorial boundaries had been established, members of Iron Wolves, Urban Prophets, and Midnight Collective worked together to patrol Ghost Block and protect each other from unknown threats. The collaboration revealed how much artistic skill and creative energy had been suppressed by territorial competition. Working together, the crews created a massive memorial mural for Tommy Chen that covered an entire building wall with technical complexity and emotional depth that surpassed anything individual crews had produced. The piece incorporated elements from Chinese American culture, Oakland street art traditions, and hip-hop aesthetics, creating a synthesis that celebrated Tommy's identity while mourning his absence. But the cooperative spirit proved fragile when faced with the psychological pressure of ongoing uncertainty about Tommy's fate and the nature of the threat they were confronting. By late December, paranoia began fragmenting the temporary alliance as crew members started suspecting each other of withholding information or pursuing hidden agendas. The breakdown accelerated when David Kim, the artist known as Phoenix who had been beaten in November, returned to Ghost Block with a proposal that divided the artistic community. During his recovery from the assault, Kim had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to create a film about Oakland's underground graffiti scene. The project offered payment to artists who participated, and promised to bring national attention to their work. The documentary proposal crystallized existing tensions about commercialization, while adding new concerns about exploitation and exposure. Some crew members saw the opportunity as a chance to transform their artistic skills into sustainable income and bring mainstream recognition to their neighborhood's creative renaissance. Others viewed the project as gentrification through media, a way for outsiders to profit from documenting the struggles of abandoned communities without addressing underlying problems. Sage and urban prophets took the most militant opposition to the documentary project, arguing that media attention would bring police scrutiny and potentially endanger the underground nature of their artistic practice. "They want to turn our resistance into entertainment," Sage declared. "They want to package our struggle for people who will never understand what it means to create beauty in spaces that the world has forgotten." The debate over the documentary created new factional divisions that cut across existing crew boundaries. Some Iron Wolves members supported participation, while others opposed it. Midnight Collective found themselves split between members who wanted to showcase Oakland's hip-hop scene and those who feared media attention would destroy the authentic community they had been building. David Kim, caught in the middle of these competing perspectives, became a lightning rod for tensions that reflected deeper questions about identity, authenticity, and survival in marginalized communities. His outsider status made him a convenient scapegoat for anxieties that extended far beyond the documentary project. The pressure reached a breaking point on December 28th, when Kim was found beaten unconscious in an alley 3 blocks from Ghost Block. Unlike his previous assault, which had involved pushing and shoving that escalated into violence, this attack appeared to have been systematic and deliberately brutal. Emergency medical responders found evidence suggesting he had been struck repeatedly with a blunt instrument and left for dead. David Kim survived the attack, but suffered permanent injuries, including hearing loss and cognitive impairment, that ended his artistic career. He refused to identify his attackers and moved back to Los Angeles as soon as he was released from the hospital, effectively disappearing from Oakland's art scene forever. The viciousness of the assault sent shockwaves through the Ghost Block community that were amplified by growing realization that the violence was escalating beyond anything they understood or could control. What had begun as artistic territorial disputes had evolved into something that was claiming lives and destroying the creative community that had emerged from urban abandonment. Detective Morrison's investigation into the Kim assault revealed the same lack of witnesses and evidence that had hampered the search for Tommy Chen. But the severity of Kim's injuries prompted increased police attention to Ghost Block, including regular patrol presence that began disrupting the underground art scene that had flourished in the absence of law enforcement. The increased police presence created a paradox for the artistic community. Many crew members had been calling for police protection in response to Tommy's disappearance and the escalating violence. But the reality of regular law enforcement meant the end of the creative freedom that had made Ghost Block attractive in the first place. Artists found themselves caught between wanting protection and preserving the autonomous space they had created. Community activist Maria Santos attempted to mediate between the artistic community and law enforcement by organizing meetings where crew members could communicate their concerns to police, while officers could explain their investigative needs. But the sessions revealed fundamental incompatibilities between underground art culture and formal law enforcement approaches. The police wanted names, addresses, real identities of everyone involved, Santos recalled. But the whole point of the graffiti scene was anonymity and operating outside official systems. The kids couldn't give the police what they wanted without destroying the culture they were trying to protect. January 1989 brought the discovery that transformed Ghost Block from a crime scene into a horror that would haunt Oakland for years. A city utility worker investigating reports of waterline damage found human remains in the basement of an abandoned house on the north side of the street. The skeletal remains were identified as Tommy Chen through dental records, ending weeks of uncertainty about his fate, while opening far more disturbing questions about what had happened to him. The coroner's investigation revealed that Tommy had died from blunt force trauma, but the condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exact cause of death or establish a timeline for when he had been killed. More troubling, the basement location suggested his body had been deliberately hidden rather than left where he had been attacked. The discovery of Tommy's remains coincided with the disappearance of two more young artists, Maria Gonzalez, a 15-year-old who had recently started participating in Urban Prophets activities, and Kevin Jackson, a member of Midnight Collective, who had been documenting the scene through photography. Both had last been seen on Ghost Block, and both vanished without leaving any trace of their fate. The pattern of disappearances targeting young artists created panic throughout Oakland's underground art community. Crews from other neighborhoods stopped visiting Ghost Block. The weekend gatherings that had brought dozens of participants to the area ceased entirely. Even longtime crew members began avoiding the space they had fought so hard to claim and defend. Marcus Williams found himself alone on Ghost Block for the first time since he had discovered the abandoned street 16 months earlier. Standing in the shadow of the wolf mural that he and Tommy had created together, he realized that their artistic vision had been consumed by forces they had never anticipated and couldn't control. "We thought we were creating something beautiful," he said during his final interview about Ghost Block. "We thought we were bringing life back to a place that had been forgotten, but something was hunting us, picking us off one by one, and we never figured out what it was or how to stop it." The transformation of Ghost Block from artistic haven to killing ground represented more than the failure of an underground art scene. It revealed the vulnerability of young people attempting to create meaning and community in spaces abandoned by formal institutions, and the devastating consequences when that creative energy attracted predatory attention from forces they were powerless to understand or resist. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would claim 9 more lives and leave Ghost Block permanently marked as one of Oakland's most disturbing, unsolved cases, a reminder of what happens when society's most vulnerable members are left to protect themselves in spaces where normal rules no longer apply. The final phase of the Ghost Block tragedy began with what investigators would later describe as a catastrophic failure of communication between Oakland Police Department units responding to multiple emergency calls on the night of February 14, 1989. What should have been a coordinated law enforcement response to reports of gunshots and screaming became a bureaucratic nightmare that allowed the most violent night in the area's history to unfold with minimal official intervention. Detective Ray Morrison, who had been tracking the escalating pattern of disappearances and violence since Tommy Chen's vanishing in December, was off duty when the emergency calls began flooding the police dispatch system at 11:47 p.m. The first call came from Mrs. Dorothy Washington, the elderly resident who had been monitoring Ghost Block activity from her home 3 streets away. She reported hearing what sounded like rapid gunfire, followed by shouting and car engines. The second call, logged at 11:52 p.m., came from a security guard at a warehouse 6 blocks from Ghost Block, who reported seeing muzzle flashes and hearing screams coming from the direction of the abandoned residential area. A third caller, identified only as male, approximately 20 years old, whispered into the phone that "they're shooting everybody," before the line went dead. The police response revealed institutional problems that had been building since the first incidents on Ghost Block. The area fell into a jurisdictional gray zone, where patrol responsibilities were unclear, and the lack of recent criminal activity had resulted in reduced priority status for emergency calls from the neighborhood. The first patrol unit didn't arrive on scene until 12:31 a.m., nearly 45 minutes after the initial reports. Officer Patricia Monroe, the same officer who had responded to David Kim's first assault in November, found Ghost Block apparently empty when she arrived for her preliminary sweep. Her patrol car's spotlight revealed fresh graffiti covering several building walls, but no signs of immediate danger or criminal activity. The abandoned buildings that had housed the underground art scene for over a year appeared as deserted as they had been before the artists arrived. Monroe's initial report, filed at 1:15 a.m., noted no visible evidence of gunfire or disturbance, and recommended that the multiple emergency calls be classified as false reports, possibly generated by fireworks or car backfire sounds that had been misinterpreted by nervous residents. The report reflected standard protocol for patrol responses to abandoned areas where emergency calls often proved unfounded. But Maria Santos, the community activist who had been documenting Ghost Block since its emergence as an art destination, was conducting her own investigation that night. Unable to sleep after hearing distant sounds that reminded her of the urban warfare that had plagued Oakland during the height of the crack epidemic, she had driven to the area around midnight to check on the safety of the young artists she had been monitoring. Santos's account of that night, recorded in detailed journal entries and later corroborated by physical evidence, revealed that Officer Monroe's patrol had missed the most significant crime scene in Oakland's recent history by a matter of minutes. When Santos arrived at Ghost Block at approximately 12:45 a.m., she discovered what she initially thought was an elaborate art installation covering the abandoned buildings with dark paint in abstract patterns. "It took me a few seconds to realize I wasn't looking at artwork," Santos recalled during her testimony to the Oakland Police Internal Affairs investigation. "The patterns on the walls weren't paint, they were blood. And the shapes on the ground weren't debris or art supplies, they were bodies." Santos's emergency call, placed at 12:51 a.m., brought Detective Morrison and a full crime scene investigation team to Ghost Block within 20 minutes. What they discovered would be classified as the largest mass killing in Oakland's history and one of the most disturbing crime scenes that veteran investigators had encountered in their careers. 12 bodies were found throughout the abandoned buildings, each showing evidence of execution-style gunshot wounds to the head. The victims were arranged in what appeared to be deliberate positions, with some placed to face specific murals, while others were positioned as if they had been attempting to flee. The careful staging suggested the killings had been carried out methodically rather than during a spontaneous outbreak of violence. The identification of victims revealed the scope of the tragedy that had consumed Ghost Block's artistic community. Marcus Williams, the co-founder of Iron Wolves who had discovered the abandoned street 16 months earlier, was found in the basement of the burned duplex where he and Tommy Chen had created their first collaborative mural. Jerome Parker, leader of Midnight Collective, was discovered in the former corner store that had served as a venue for the hip-hop gatherings that had brought dozens of young people to the area. Most disturbing was the discovery of Sage, the enigmatic leader of Urban Prophets, whose body was found positioned in front of the memorial mural that all three crews had created collaboratively to honor Tommy Chen's memory. The symbolic nature of his placement suggested that whoever had orchestrated the killings possessed intimate knowledge of the relationships and conflicts within Ghost Block's art scene. The remaining victims included crew members from all three groups, as well as several young artists who had been attempting to establish their own presence on Ghost Block in recent weeks. Among them was Lisa Martinez, a 16-year-old who had been one of the few female artists regularly participating in the scene, found near a piece she had been working on that depicted children playing in abandoned lots. Roberto Ghost Valdez, whose tag had become synonymous with the block's transformation, was discovered positioned beneath his largest and most complex mural, as if he had been forced to contemplate his own artistic legacy before being killed. The diversity of victims indicated that the killings had not targeted a specific crew, but rather the entire underground community that had emerged around the abandoned street. This comprehensive elimination of the artistic community suggested a level of planning and surveillance that chilled investigators who realized the perpetrators had been methodically cataloging every participant in Ghost Block's cultural renaissance. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the UC Berkeley sociologist who had been studying urban youth movements, was brought in as a consultant to help investigators understand the cultural context of the crime scene. His analysis revealed layers of symbolic meaning in how the bodies had been positioned that suggested the killings had been designed to send a message to Oakland's broader underground art community. The positioning wasn't random, Rodriguez explained during his consultation with the investigation team. Each victim was placed in a location that held specific meaning within the territorial and social structure of Ghost Block. The killer or killers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationships, conflicts, and hierarchies within the graffiti scene. It was as if they were creating their own twisted artwork, using the bodies as elements in a composition that only they fully understood. The symbolic staging of the crime scene raised disturbing questions about whether the perpetrators had been monitoring the Ghost Block community for an extended period, gathering intelligence about individual artists and their roles within crew dynamics. The level of knowledge required to orchestrate such a psychologically complex crime suggested either insider involvement or systematic surveillance that had gone undetected for months. Detective Morrison's investigation team faced immediate challenges that reflected broader institutional problems with law enforcement response to crimes in abandoned urban areas. The lack of regular patrol presence meant minimal baseline information about normal activity patterns. No security cameras covered Ghost Block, and the underground nature of the art scene meant many potential witnesses were reluctant to cooperate with police investigation. The forensic evidence painted a disturbing picture of calculated violence that had been planned and executed with military-style precision. Ballistics analysis revealed that multiple weapons had been used, suggesting a coordinated attack involving several perpetrators. The lack of defensive wounds on most victims indicated they had been caught by surprise or controlled through intimidation before being killed. Most troubling was the discovery of evidence suggesting the killings had been filmed. Abandoned video equipment found in several locations included cameras that had been positioned to record the crime from multiple angles. The footage had been removed, but technical analysis of the equipment revealed it had been recording during the time frame when the murders occurred. Additionally, investigators found evidence of professional lighting equipment and sound recording devices, suggesting the documentation had been planned with the same meticulous attention to detail as the murders themselves. The possibility that the Ghost Block killings had been documented for unknown purposes added a dimension of horror that extended beyond the immediate tragedy. Investigators realized they were dealing with perpetrators who had not only killed 12 young people, but had treated the murders as a form of entertainment or documentation that served purposes they could only speculate about. The professional quality of the recording equipment suggested the footage might have been intended for distribution to unknown audiences, a possibility that haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Coroner's reports revealed additional disturbing details about the final hours of the victims. Time of death analysis indicated the killings had occurred over approximately 3 hours, suggesting the perpetrators had taken their time with each murder, rather than conducting a quick mass execution. Some victims showed evidence of having been restrained for extended periods before being killed, implying they had been forced to watch other murders before meeting their own fate. Toxicology reports found traces of sedatives in several victims' bloodstreams, indicating they may have been drugged before the killings commenced. The use of chemical restraints suggested a level of premeditation that extended beyond simply planning a mass murder to include psychological torture designed to maximize the victim's suffering and the perpetrator's control over the situation. Community reaction to the mass killing reflected broader tensions about institutional failure and social abandonment that had created conditions for the tragedy. Activists like Maria Santos argued that the murders represented the predictable outcome of municipal neglect and police indifference toward young people of color, attempting to create positive activities in forgotten neighborhoods. These kids died because nobody in authority cared what was happening to them until it was too late, Santos declared during a press conference demanding increased police accountability. They tried to create something beautiful in a space that had been abandoned by the city, and instead of supporting them or protecting them, the system ignored them until they became victims of something evil that could have been prevented. The criticism resonated throughout Oakland's communities of color, where the Ghost Block killings became a symbol of institutional failure that extended far beyond law enforcement. Parents, educators, and community leaders organized vigils and protests demanding better protection for young people and increased investment in abandoned neighborhoods where criminal activity could flourish in the absence of legitimate alternatives. Reverend Michael Thompson, pastor of Greater Mount Olive Baptist Church and a prominent voice in Oakland's African-American community, used his Sunday sermon following the discovery to address broader questions about society's responsibility to its most vulnerable members. These young people were trying to transform abandoned spaces into places of hope and creativity, Thompson declared. Instead of celebrating their vision and supporting their dreams, we let them face danger alone in places where evil could hunt them without consequences. Their blood cries out not just for justice, but for fundamental changes in how we treat our children and our communities. But the investigation also revealed disturbing evidence that the tragedy might have been preventable through better communication between law enforcement agencies. FBI records obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests years later showed that federal authorities had been tracking a suspected serial killer who targeted young artists in urban areas across California. The FBI investigation, codenamed Operation Canvas, had identified a pattern of killings in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento involving graffiti artists who disappeared from abandoned buildings before their bodies were discovered in remote locations. The federal investigation had been monitoring similar activities in Oakland since late 1988, but had not shared intelligence with local law enforcement until after the Ghost Block massacre. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who led the federal investigation, later testified before congressional hearings about information-sharing failures that contributed to the tragedy. We had evidence suggesting Oakland graffiti artists were being targeted by the same perpetrators responsible for killings in other California cities, Walsh explained. But bureaucratic protocols prevented us from sharing that intelligence with local authorities until we had completed federal jurisdiction requirements. Those protocols cost 12 young people their lives. The revelation that federal authorities had possessed information that might have prevented the Ghost Block killings sparked outrage among families of victims and demands for accountability from law enforcement agencies at all levels. Congressional hearings examined systemic failures in communication between FBI and local police departments that had allowed serial killers to operate across jurisdictional boundaries without triggering coordinated responses. Representative Barbara Lee, who represented Oakland in Congress, used the hearings to demand fundamental reforms in how federal and local law enforcement agencies shared intelligence about serial crimes. The bureaucratic turf wars and jurisdictional jealousies that prevented information sharing in this case represent a betrayal of law enforcement's most basic responsibility to protect innocent lives, Lee declared during her questioning of FBI officials. The federal investigation eventually identified the Ghost Block perpetrators as members of what authorities termed a murder cult that had been operating throughout California since 1987. Led by a charismatic figure known only as the Curator, the group consisted of individuals who viewed underground art scenes as hunting grounds for victims who could be killed without triggering significant law enforcement attention. The Curator's identity remained unknown despite extensive investigation, but behavioral analysis suggested an individual with military or law enforcement training who had developed an obsession with documenting the destruction of urban artistic communities. The group's modus operandi involved infiltrating underground art scenes, gathering intelligence about participants and territorial dynamics, then orchestrating mass killings designed to eliminate entire creative communities. FBI psychological profilers theorized that the Curator viewed urban art scenes as threats to social order that needed to be eliminated through spectacular violence that would deter other young people from participating in underground creative activities. The careful documentation of the killings suggested they were intended as propaganda tools designed to spread fear throughout artistic communities across urban America. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a disturbing picture of perpetrators who combined organizational sophistication with sadistic motivation. The careful staging of crime scenes and systematic documentation suggested the killings served psychological needs that went beyond simple violence, representing a form of performance art that used murder as creative medium. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a criminal psychologist who consulted on the federal investigation, described the Curator as representing a new type of serial killer whose motivations combined political ideology with pathological need for control. This individual appears to have viewed urban artistic communities as chaotic forces that needed to be eliminated through systematic violence, Hartman explained. The documentation suggests he saw himself as creating order through destruction, using murder as a tool for social engineering. The investigation uncovered evidence of similar attacks on underground art scenes in Portland, Seattle, and Denver, suggesting the Curator's organization had been operating throughout the western United States for several years before the Ghost Block massacre. In each case, emerging artistic communities in abandoned urban areas had been eliminated through coordinated mass killings that left no survivors and minimal evidence. 3 arrests were eventually made in connection with the Ghost Block killings, but prosecutions failed due to jurisdictional complications and evidence chain problems that reflected the complex multi-agency investigation. 2 suspects died in custody, under circumstances that raised additional questions about the extent of the conspiracy and the possibility of additional perpetrators who remained unidentified. The first suspect, identified as William "Billy" Morrison, no relation to Detective Morrison, was found dead in his San Quentin prison cell 3 days after his arrest, apparently having committed suicide using bed sheets fashioned into a noose. However, the coroner's investigation revealed injuries inconsistent with hanging, suggesting Morrison might have been murdered by other inmates or correctional staff to prevent him from revealing information about the larger conspiracy. The second suspect, Maria Elena Vasquez, died during an apparent escape attempt while being transported between detention facilities. According to official reports, Vasquez grabbed a corrections officer's weapon and was shot while attempting to flee. But witnesses reported that Vasquez had been cooperative throughout her detention and showed no previous signs of attempting to escape, raising questions about whether her death was actually an execution designed to silence her. The third suspect, identified only as Robert M. due to legal restrictions, was released after charges were dropped when key evidence was ruled inadmissible due to search and seizure violations. Robert M. disappeared from California shortly after his release and has never been located despite ongoing federal investigation. Defense attorneys for the suspects argued that their clients were themselves victims of the Curators organization, recruited through psychological manipulation and coercion, rather than willing participants in mass murder. They presented evidence suggesting that several members of the murder cult had been selected from vulnerable populations, homeless veterans, individuals with mental illness, people struggling with addiction, who had been exploited by more sophisticated organizers. The failure to successfully prosecute anyone for the Ghost Block killings became a source of lasting anguish for victims' families and a symbol of systemic failure within the criminal justice system. 12 young people had been killed in what investigators characterized as one of the most psychologically complex crimes in California history. But legal technicalities prevented accountability for perpetrators who had treated murder as performance art. Carmen Williams, Marcus Williams' mother, dedicated the remainder of her life to advocating for victims' rights and criminal justice reform after her son's death. "My boy was trying to create beauty in a world that had too much ugliness," she said during a 1995 interview. "He and his friends deserved protection, not abandonment. They deserved justice, not bureaucratic excuses that let their killers escape consequences." Mrs. Dorothy Washington, the neighborhood resident who had made the first emergency call reporting gunshots, spent her remaining years advocating for institutional changes that might prevent similar tragedies. She testified before city council meetings, state legislative hearings, and federal oversight committees about the need for better protection of young people in abandoned urban areas. Those children were trying to bring beauty to a place that everybody else had given up on, Washington said during her final public statement before her death in 1995. They deserved protection, not abandonment. They deserved justice, not bureaucratic excuses. Their death should mean something more than another failure of the system that was supposed to keep them safe. The psychological impact of the Ghost Block massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Underground art scenes throughout California experienced mass exodus as young artists abandoned building spaces in fear that they might be targeted by copycat killers or remaining members of the Curators organization. The vibrant street art culture that had been emerging in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego withered as creative spaces were abandoned due to safety concerns. Oakland's hip-hop and graffiti communities never fully recovered from the trauma of losing an entire generation of emerging artists in a single night. The collaborative spirit that had briefly flourished on Ghost Block, bringing together young people from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds gave way to suspicion and isolation as survivors struggled with post-traumatic stress and fear of continued targeting. Antonio Flaco Morales, the former Urban Prophets member who had left Oakland before the massacre, attempted to return to the city in 1991, but found the artistic community so diminished and traumatized that he abandoned plans to resume his involvement in street art. "It was like a bomb had gone off in the heart of Oakland's creative soul," he said during a 1996 interview. "The kids who survived were too scared to create, and the kids who might have joined the scene stayed away because they knew what could happen." Ghost Block itself was demolished by the city of Oakland in 1991, with the abandoned buildings razed and the area converted into a small memorial park dedicated to victims of urban violence. But the physical destruction of the crime scene could not erase the psychological impact on Oakland's communities or answer the questions about institutional failure that the tragedy had raised. The memorial park, designed through community input coordinated by Maria Santos, incorporated elements that honored the artistic vision that had flourished briefly on Ghost Block. Reproductions of the crew's collaborative memorial mural for Tommy Chen were etched into granite walls, while bronze plaques listed the names and ages of all 12 victims, along with brief descriptions of their artistic contributions to the community. The centerpiece of the memorial was a bronze sculpture depicting young people painting on a wall, their faces turned toward the sky in expressions of hope and determination. The inscription below read, "They dared to dream in places where dreams were needed most. Their vision shall not be forgotten." The memorial quickly became a pilgrimage site for artists and activists from throughout the Bay Area, though many visitors reported feeling overcome with sadness and anger rather than inspiration. The case remains officially open with the Oakland Police Department, though active investigation ceased in 1994, when federal authorities concluded that the suspected perpetrators had either died or left California. Detective Ray Morrison, who led the initial investigation, retired in 1996 and has declined all interview requests about the case since leaving the department. In his final report, Morrison wrote, "The Ghost Block case represents multiple systemic failures that allowed preventable tragedy to occur. Young people attempting to create positive activities in abandoned spaces deserved institutional support rather than institutional neglect. Their deaths haunt everyone involved in this investigation and should serve as a permanent reminder of the cost of abandoning our most vulnerable community members." Community activist Maria Santos continued documenting urban youth movements until her death in 2018, but she never again encountered an artistic renaissance comparable to what had emerged on Ghost Block during its brief flowering. In her final interview about the case, she reflected on what had been lost when the underground art scene was destroyed by violence. "They created something magical in that forgotten place," Santos said. "For 16 months, that abandoned street became the most creative, vital space in Oakland. Young people from different backgrounds came together to make art that expressed their hopes and struggles and dreams. But instead of supporting that creativity, our society allowed it to be destroyed by evil that we should have seen coming and stopped." Santos's archives, donated to the Oakland Museum of California after her death, contain thousands of photographs documenting not just the Ghost Block scene, but dozens of other attempts by young artists to reclaim abandoned urban spaces throughout the Bay Area. Her work reveals a pattern of creative renaissance, followed by institutional neglect and ultimate abandonment that speaks to broader questions about society's relationship to its most marginalized communities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Operation Canvas was officially closed in 2001 after more than a decade of investigation failed to locate the curator or definitively identify the organizational structure of the murder cult. However, FBI profilers continue to monitor unusual patterns of violence targeting artistic communities, and several unsolved cases from the 1990s and 2000s show similarities to the Ghost Block methodology. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who led the federal investigation until her retirement in 1998, has written extensively about the institutional failures that contributed to the Ghost Block tragedy. Her book, Canvas of Blood: How Bureaucracy Failed 12 Young Artists, became required reading at the FBI Academy and has influenced reforms in information sharing protocols between federal and local law enforcement agencies. The Ghost Block case taught us that underground communities often face threats, that traditional law enforcement approaches are not designed to detect or prevent, Walsh wrote. When young people create alternative social structures in abandoned spaces, they become vulnerable to predators who understand that their victims will not be protected by conventional security systems. We have a responsibility to adapt our methods to protect all members of society, not just those who live within mainstream institutional frameworks. The Ghost Block tragedy stands as a reminder of what can be lost when society abandons its most vulnerable members in spaces where normal protections do not apply. 12 young artists died because they dared to create beauty in a place that had been forgotten, and their deaths revealed institutional failures that continue to haunt Oakland's efforts to support youth creativity and prevent urban violence. The murals that covered Ghost Block's buildings were photographed extensively before demolition, and reproductions are displayed in Oakland's Museum of Community History as monuments to artistic vision that flourished briefly in the shadows before being consumed by darkness that remains incompletely understood. The images serve as both celebration of creative courage and warning about what happens when society fails to protect those who dare to dream in places where dreams are most needed and most vulnerable to destruction. In 2019, 30 years after the massacre, Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf announced the Ghost Block Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing financial support for young artists from underserved communities to pursue formal arts education. The program, funded through private donations coordinated by the families of Ghost Block victims, has supported more than 100 young artists in developing their creative skills within safe, supervised environments. "We cannot bring back the 12 young people we lost," Mayor Schaaf said during the scholarship program's announcement, "but we can honor their memory by ensuring that future generations of artists receive the support and protection they deserved." Ghost Block must stand as more than a symbol of institutional failure. It must become a catalyst for institutional change. The scholarship recipients are required to complete community service projects that bring art to underserved neighborhoods, but always within frameworks that provide adult supervision and security measures. The program represents an attempt to preserve the community-building spirit that had emerged on Ghost Block while protecting young artists from the vulnerabilities that made them targets for predatory violence. Yet questions remain about whether institutional reforms can adequately address the deeper social problems that created conditions for the Ghost Block tragedy. The abandonment of urban neighborhoods, the lack of legitimate opportunities for creative expression among marginalized youth, and the persistence of bureaucratic barriers that prevent effective coordination between different levels of law enforcement continue to challenge efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The final word belongs to Carmen Williams, Marcus Williams's mother, who until her death in 2017 maintained a private memorial in her home featuring her son's artwork and photographs from the Ghost Block scene. In her last interview, she reflected on the legacy of the young artists who had transformed an abandoned street into a canvas for hope before becoming victims of unimaginable evil. "Marcus and his friends believed art could change the world," she said. "They proved it was possible to create beauty and community in places everyone else had given up on. Evil stopped them, but it couldn't destroy what they proved was possible. Somewhere, other young artists are still fighting to make beauty in forgotten places. We owe them better protection than we gave my son and his friends, but we also owe them the freedom to dream and create that Marcus died defending."